Hi, and welcome to the first edition of The Right Question, a video podcast about writing. I'm Daphne Gray-Grant, but you may know me as the publication coach. For the past 30 years, I've been helping people with writing. Recently, I decided I wanted to take a new step and launch a video podcast answering your questions about writing. Today's question comes from Michael Watson of Baltimore, Maryland, and it reflects on something I talk about all the time. Seriously. All the time. The question is, why don't I outline? Or more specifically, what I have against outlining. So here's my complaint. Outlining forces you into a linear, logical way of thinking. That's not a totally bad thing, of course, but it's not very creative. When you write, you want your brain to operate in the most creative way possible. You don't want to be hemmed in by anything. But an outline acts like a drill sergeant. It takes something that should be fun and turns it into an obligation. If you're not keen to write, having someone scream at you, "Now, drop and give me 20," that's not going to help. But here's the worst thing about outlining. It's practically allergic to stories. And stories are what make writing interesting. Have you ever tried to jam a story into an outline? It's like taking a really big box and trying to jam it into a very narrow drawer. I don't like any technique that automatically excludes stories. Just let me add that I'm not entirely opposed to outlining, however. There's one time when it does make sense to use it, but sadly, almost no one does. And this is when you're finished your story. This is called reverse outlining, and that means creating an outline after you've finished writing. Doing an outline at this point exposes the underlying structure of what you've written. And this can show you if there are any holes or gaps in your structure, and that's something you can fix when you're editing. I actually did this a lot when I was in high school. Many of the nuns who taught us demanded that we hand in an outline with every essay we submitted. They were cruel in other ways, too. Thinking I was being a real rebel, I always wrote the essay first and did the outline afterwards. Other kids went to the forest behind the school to smoke, but in my mind, I was still a rebel. Anyway, as far as I'm concerned, there's no really good reason ever to do an outline before you start writing. But when I tell the writers I work with, they often look at me with something close to panic in their eyes. How could I possibly take this tool away from them? So this might be a good time for me to mention another technique that you can use instead of outlining: mind mapping. There are thousands of great articles on why mind mapping is such a useful tool. A few of them I've written myself. I'll link to them in the description. For sure, I'll be talking more about mind mapping in future episodes of this podcast. And that brings me to one last point. I really want to be sure to answer your questions. If you have any questions you want me to answer about writing, you can email, tweet, or leave a message on my Skype voicemail. Details are in the description. And before I go, remember the words of E.B. White, author of Charlotte's Web and many other fine pieces of writing. Commas in the New Yorker, he said, fall with the precision of knives in a circus act, outlining the victim. That's the only type of outline I'm interested in hearing about. I'll see you next week.